All right, hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I'm with my friend Antonio. Antonio and I met when you came to the Chicago meetup. When was that? That was 3 years ago, I think.
Um, it could have been.
No,
No, it
it
wasn't
was
last year. Was it last year?
no, it was 2 years ago, right? Because it couldn't have
In
been
June.
in the heart of COVID. So it was
Oh
like two
yeah,
and a half. Yeah, it was like two and a
yeah.
half years ago. Where the Chicago Bridges of Meaning group, the group that I lead, that's sort of like a discussion group of all things Paul Vanderklay and Jordan Peterson and all things related. We hosted a sort of a larger conference. I wouldn't call it a large conference. I think over 200 people came. Let's see here. Some of the speakers were Paul Vanderklay, Bethel McGrew, Parker Sedekase, and Renn. What's interesting is like I had no exposure to Renn before that meetup. And he, I feel like, has become more and more prominent, and people are paying more and more attention to him since that meetup happened. So I feel kind of honored to have met him. That was kind of cool. What did you think of that meetup?
Oh, I thought it was great. There were two things I was really looking forward to in Chicago. One was meeting everybody in person, and the other was the Chicago Pie Pizza.
Yeah,
Yeah, that definitely
which
was
we
not a
had.
letdown. Yeah, that was really good.
Mm-hmm.
No, I thought it was really great. It was nice seeing Jacob there. I've met Jacob before in person. It was nice meeting you and Paul Vanderklay, and my lady came with me, which was it
Mm-hmm.
was just a really interesting experience all the way around.
Well,
But it felt
good.
very friendly.
And so you're someone who pays pretty close attention to the things going on in this corner of the internet. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your story. And I get the impression you're someone like me whose life has been set adrift on some personal quest for understanding Christology and theology. And you never quite know where that's going to take someone if they're engaged in open and honest inquiry. So I want to hear a little bit more about your story and how you've gotten to where you are. And then I hear that you have some questions on some topics that you want to discuss with me. So let's start with how did you come to be in the position that you are now?
Wow. So, I mean, my upbringing is I was raised in a secular household. My
Mm,
parents were religiously unaffiliated, but they both believed in God. So I was effectively an atheist my whole life until I came around this little corner, and that happened because I met Jacob about 5 years ago on Bret Weinstein's Facebook group. And that was more of a culture war, red pilling type of event.
mhm.
Um, that those memories are a little bit foggy for me as to how that happened exactly, but I just know that was a precursor to um, discovering Paul Vanderklay's community and YouTube channel. So yeah, I guess when we first spoke, I was still at a religious crossroads. I
Uh-huh.
was at the point where I didn't think atheism was viable anymore. I thought that was pretty clear, not just from my own personal experiences, but um, with all the discussions I was having online, and especially at that time before this little corner, I was engaging in a lot of culture war conversations and discussions.
Sure. So, what's sort of your academic background like, and what do you do professionally in those sorts of things?
Oh yeah, this is my favorite part. I have no credentials at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm a high school dropout. I got my GED, and um, I basically just been working, uh, just entry level work. My first job was at Dutch Harbor, Alaska, working at a seafood processing plant, and
Wow.
yeah, no, there's a whole, I got a whole history of that. I guess the long story short is I kind of felt like I had to prove myself after dropping out of high school.
Hmm.
um, I had this, I kind of had a complex about my own study habits and um, work ethic, and I figured if I wasn't gonna be good enough in the academic side of things, I better at least get my stuff together on the workforce side of things.
Hmm.
So, so right now I work at Costco.
Hmm.
I've kind of always been drawn towards the more, I guess, mechanical or more more skilled technical side of things. So I know how to drive forklifts. Right now I'm a tire installer. And then I picked up an electrical apprenticeship right before I had my son.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so have you had the kind of jobs where you can listen to a lot of podcasts during the day?
I'd say about half the time.
Yeah.
Some jobs were that independent without supervision, where I was able to listen to a lot of content.
Because that
But with
seems to be a common ingredient for a lot of people in this little
yeah,
corner of the internet, is that they have a job that allows them to listen to an inordinate amount of podcasts.
yep.
And that's how they end up meeting these people and getting interested in these subjects.
Yeah, and I'm definitely I consider myself much more a listener than a speaker on these types of things. Like I probably have listened to way more than I can ever hope to articulate. But yeah.
Interesting. So tell me a little bit about the steps on your religious process, because I know that I remember talking with you back when you were here in Chicago and Jacob was around the table and you were sort of interested in Noahidism. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, what that is, and sort of where you've come since then?
Yeah. So the concept of a Noahide is pretty straightforward to me, but it always seems difficult to explain to other religious types just because the framing it's completely different. It's kind of predicated on the idea that nobody is adopted like into like we're all God's children. It's just within Judaism. So there's like an issue of using terms of Noahide because of the Noahide laws. So there could be people who are Noahides that just fall within the 7 laws who observe them incidentally, basically. And then there are people who, like me, I believe Judaism is true, and so I look to intentionally observe the 7 laws, more or less.
So tell me about some of the books that you've read and the influences that have affected your journey so far.
Yeah. The funny thing is, I think Bret Weinstein was the first domino to fall.
Yeah.
It's funny because he's not religious as far as I know. But it was when he was on Joe Rogan, I think, and he was explaining religion through an evolutionary lens.
Mm-hmm.
And I never thought about religion that way, and that kind of just like blew my mind a little bit.
Even though he still has a pretty condescending attitude towards
Yep.
religion at the end of the day, it is slightly different than the new atheist take that religion is just this evil mind virus. He's like, no, it's a good mind virus.
Yeah.
It's a useful mind virus, but
Yep.
it's still a mind virus and a useful fiction.
Yeah. So I guess I have to thank him for that, but that was the first step. And then somehow or another, well, I know I ended up in Jordan Peterson land like everybody else. That was very clear. But then I came across Bart Ehrman. He was like probably the first of that type from that crowd that I really came across, and I bought his book Heaven and Hell, History of the Afterlife. Yeah, no, it's funny because I think what happened was it was during George Floyd, and that was like peak concern for me about humanity.
Sure.
Just because of the lashback and what was happening in the news, and I had just binged a whole bunch of Jordan Peterson's content about the horrors of the 20th century. I'm like, oh man, what's to stop this from happening again? And I don't know. I guess from there, somehow I started digging deeper into religion and the history of religion, and it really just started with a question: what really is the Christian take on heaven and hell? Because my exposure to Christians were, it was like, oh, you believe in Jesus. If you don't, hellfire. That's kind of like
Right.
that
And
was the
immediately
majority.
after death, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I came across Bart Ehrman, and he basically presented the case that heaven and hell developed over time, and it probably wasn't what the early Christians thought about the afterlife. And
It's funny. I have sort of a love-hate relationship with Bart Ehrman. I've read a whole bunch of his books too, and like honestly, I've gotten a lot out of them. I'm really I don't want to just univocally criticize the guy. I've learned a lot from him, and I don't know. I've probably read 4 or 5 of his books. I didn't read that one on heaven and hell. But I will say the church that I grew up in had a very unique teaching on heaven and hell. And as far as I can tell from his book, Bart Ehrman was basically saying like Sam's little church actually got it right. And in that, like what my church taught is that once you've died, you're asleep. You're not conscious somewhere, either up or down. And that words like Hades and Sheol are just kind of euphemisms for being in the grave underground. It's sort of like how we'd say someone's 6 feet underground or something like that. And that you're just sort of unconsciously waiting the resurrection. And then when Jesus returns, there's the resurrection, and the righteous will be granted eternal life in the kingdom of heaven on earth, a new earth and a new heaven and a new kingdom on earth. And that the dead will be consciously, or the unrighteous will be consciously resurrected, judged, and then thrown in hellfire. But hellfire is consuming and destroying, not like eternally punishing. And so then after that process is done, the only people who are alive are the righteous in Christ, and they live forever. And so like growing up, I always had to constantly kind of code switch depending on which Christians, I was around, and would get into theological arguments. So like honestly, even more so than the Trinitarian stuff, like growing up, that felt like what was actually one of the biggest differences between me and most other Christians was views of the afterlife. And that because it's talked about way more often, especially in evangelical churches, than the Trinity. The Trinity, it felt like, okay, yeah, we disagree about it, but at some level, it doesn't seem like a lot of you guys actually care about it. And so it's easy to disagree with you because it's sort of just one of those things that it feels like you're supposed to believe, but you don't understand. Whereas people in the afterlife, if they heard my views of the afterlife, so you're telling me my grandma Susie is not up there looking down at me smiling, like it seems much more personal and visceral to have a different view of the afterlife. And one thing that I've been interested in studying, as I've been going through the church fathers, I mostly pay attention to Christology, but I also pay attention to all sorts of other areas of theology as I'm reading through them. And their views on the afterlife, there seem to have been 3 kind of views. In the early stages, you can see my view, you're unconscious when you're dead, you get resurrected, and then the judgment for the wicked is eternal destruction, not eternal torment. And then there is some people who seem to think that when you're in Hades, you are quite awake, and that there's that whole bosom of Abraham stuff. And honestly, that parable of Jesus about the bosom of Abraham sometimes makes me wonder if my church didn't get the intermediate state correct. But even then, it was still like there's a nice part of Hades and a less nice part of Hades. And those are foreshadows of what's going to happen to you in the ultimate judgment. But even then, the wicked will get destroyed and the righteous will get everlasting life. It's just that people are in this sort of shadowy, semi-awake, soul without a body in Hades thing. And that to me always sounded kind of pretty Greek. But you can definitely see it there in early Christianity. And the idea of going straight to heaven when you die seems to have been a Gnostic teaching that I think just eventually won because it had this sort of emotionally resonant, compelling story to it. But you don't really see mainstream Christianity embracing that until, say, the early 4th century or maybe the late 3rd century. But, it was very late before a lot of Christians seem to have taught that Christians go straight to heaven when they die, as opposed to either being unconscious or semi-conscious in Hades underground. But anyway, I don't know if any thoughts or reactions to that.
No, I know exactly what you mean, because when I was still exploring, Bart's book, I talked to my mom about it, who she's tentatively a Christian. She's kind of been on and off and wrestling with that, and she tries to go to church and then sometimes doesn't. And then I told her about, hey, did you know that this idea was probably developed later? And she was like, what? It's like, no, I know he's up there, like looking back at me, like people I've lost and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, yeah, I could see that this is very,
Yeah. It's
the
very emotionally resonant. And even when
yeah,
people stop believing in other parts of Christianity, they keep believing in that part. And
yeah,
so I guess one has to give credit to that idea for resonating with the human soul in a certain kind of way. But when it comes to historical research, it's just clearly not the original Christian apostolic teaching. So I don't know. I think some people will be like, well, yeah, the emotional resonance proves it's true. And I tend to be a very historically rigorous person when I approach these theological questions. But yeah, I didn't read Bart Ehrman's book. I read, like, I listened to a podcast, I think, of him describing. I'm like, well, yep, I already know that stuff. So can
it
save
probably
myself
wouldn't be
the
anything new. Yeah,
right, can save myself the $24.99, which would really just be a patting myself on the back, it sounds like. But I'm glad to know that he came to a similar conclusion. And like when it comes to his approach to Christology questions, he sort of like half agrees with me, half disagrees with me. He sort of takes the approach of different parts of the New Testament had different Christologies. And only some parts of it had my Christology, but like say the Gospel of John doesn't, or something like that.
is that based on I forgot what he calls it, but it's kind of like looking at the New Testament um, with the different authors having different theologies and then comparing them. And
Yeah.
I'm on his blog, and I've seen him write about that before.
He'll even sometimes say, I think I've heard him say that the Gospel of John, even because it's sort of a chimera of different authors and perspectives, has different Christologies within it, because of the different layers and additions and authorial perspectives that somehow got agglomerated into a single book. And I just find that pretty non-credible. I prefer someone who's like, it's a cohesive whole, and here's what the cohesive whole teaches, not it's an incohesive work, and this part says this, and this part says this, and it's a jumbled, self-contradictory mess. I don't quite get the impression from the Gospel of John, but anyway, that's sort of his perspective. So, like I said, sometimes Bart Ehrman and I are in pretty close agreement, at least when it comes to a historical approach, but sometimes not. But anyway, I find him interesting, and sometimes I feel like he's a little bit of a person who sensationalizes things for attention and book sales. But yet, on the other hand, he's gotten a lot of people interested in these subjects. I think some people take his word as too authoritative. But I'm not going to wholly just condemn him either. He has an interesting role to play in this whole thing. And his not being a Christian does, in some sense, give him a little bit of credibility. So anyway, I have complex feelings on Bart Ehrman, I guess.
Yeah, no, I do too. Part of me wonders if he he makes the case, basically the agnostic case, but he one of the things that comes up in his blog a lot is how so many people get his journey wrong, how he stopped believing, and in a nutshell, he stopped believing because of the problem of suffering, the problem of evil, theodicy.
Yeah.
And part of me wonders if he's kind of just building up this case of like, okay, if I could get over that, this is what my theology would look like, or something like that. I don't know. I kind of get that sense sometimes.
Yeah. Humans are complex people. My friend Tripp, who's been on the channel a couple times, took a class with him because I think that Bart Ehrman was at UNC Chapel Hill. Maybe he still is, I think. And my friend Tripp went to Duke, but I think that Duke and UNC have reciprocal privileges. So I think he took a class from Bart Ehrman, and he was less than impressed at his ability to answer questions in class. But I can imagine Tripp being the sort of person who would be very motivated to ask the most difficult questions to Bart Ehrman in person. But yeah, and I know Bethel McGrew and the whole McGrew clan is not very big fans of Bart Ehrman. But like I said, and I think I listened to his Great Courses class. I think maybe I've even listened to 2 of his Great Courses classes, which honestly, he's a pretty good teacher. he's pretty compelling, and he is easy and interesting to listen to. And I think that I don't think that I would have the same, interest and awareness of historical issues around early Christianity if it weren't for him capturing my attention in the ways that he did. So, like I said, I'm not going to throw him under the bus. Totally.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Bart Ehrman. But really, I would say what really kicked off the crossroads journey for me was discovering Kierkegaard. Yep.
That'll do it. Yes.
Yeah.
Tell me about your adventures with Kierkegaard.
So it all started after I watched Paul Van der Klee's video. I think it was called Jordan Peterson's a Christian, Soren Kierkegaard.
Mm-hmm.
And I really liked Jordan Peterson, and I kind of related with Peterson because I was like, well, I don't really consider myself Christian. I'm a lot more sympathetic than I've ever been to religion. So if there's a guy that was a Christian that's like Jordan Peterson, maybe I should look at this guy. That's what I did. And it was just one big rabbit hole. I quickly exhausted all the web searches. So then I had to start looking into the more scholarly papers. And then I realized often I was in over my head trying to understand the language. But to my pleasant surprise, it was nice to see that a lot of Kierkegaard's writings are pretty accessible. Like they're not super difficult.
Some of it is hard, and some
Yeah.
is like, what in the world are you talking about, man? But there is enough of it. A significant majority of what he writes when you read one of his books is easy to understand, that it doesn't feel like you're, wading through morass or something like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I actually found Jordan Peterson because of Kierkegaard. I did the other way around. I was on a Kierkegaard stick. I had a friend when I was sort of having my, crises of faith in college. One of my friends was like, "Oh, you should read Kierkegaard." And so I started reading Kierkegaard. And sometimes it's like, what in the world is this going on about? And sometimes it's like, oh my goodness, this is exactly what I needed to hear. And so I think a couple years after that, I was like trying to learn a little bit more about Kierkegaard. And I was searching YouTube for Kierkegaard lecture or something like that, just into the search bar of YouTube. And one of the things that came up was Jordan Peterson's, I think, his personality class, where he has a class on like Nietzsche one of his class episodes in that series is like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And I'm like, oh, well, okay, I guess I'll listen to this. I'm not looking for Nietzsche, but, whatever, if it's mixed together, close enough. And I started listening to this. I was like, this is the most compelling and interesting professor I've basically ever heard. Who in the world is this guy? I'm like, okay, so he's a Canadian psychology professor in Toronto. I was kind of hoping for a philosophy professor, but psychology is close enough and he's good enough. And so I listened to the whole episode. I'm like, that was great. And so I started the beginning of the class, which isn't about Kierkegaard, right? Just like I got interested enough by Jordan Peterson. I'm like, man, this guy is excellent. And then what happens is, as I'm sort of going through that class over weeks or months, the Bill C16 stuff happens on his channel. And I remember at first, like the YouTube algorithm recommending me his video on Bill C16. I listened to him like, I don't care what this guy has to say about Canadian provincial politics. I just want to get back to his like classroom lectures. And then like the whole thing just sort of explodes as I'm sort of like going through his, just ordinary class. So it was actually Kierkegaard and the algorithm that introduced me to Jordan Peterson.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's like the exact opposite of how it happened for me. It was Bill C16 into Kierkegaard for me.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
So what did you find when you were reading Kierkegaard?
Well, the first thing that surprised me was like, is this guy really Christian? Because, I hate to say it, but I associated Christians with, just because of my experiences growing up, with people who didn't really want to think too deeply about the questions I was concerned about, and I guess wanted easy answers because all they talked about was salvation most of the time. And then Kierkegaard was exact opposite. He's talking about faith, suffering, purpose, and meaning. It's like, oh wow, those are all the things I've been struggling with my whole life. I wonder where we disagree, because I'm an atheist, and he's a Christian apparently, so I kind of just want to see where this goes. And I guess I had a little bit of a hope in me that maybe we weren't even that different, and then I could just, maybe adopt the religious lifestyle or something.
Yeah.
So
I remember having a conversation with Bethel McGrew one time about Kierkegaard, and she associated Kierkegaard with sort of one of the last steps on the way towards leaving faith, or something like that. Like if a Christian is reading Kierkegaard, that's a sign of that's a sign that they're on the wrong trajectory, so to speak. And I remember telling her, I'm like, I had the opposite experience. I was sort of going down, ran into Kierkegaard, and he helped sort of turn me around back in the opposite orientation. And I was like, every bridge out of the faith is also a bridge into the faith. And it's hard to predict how much traffic is going to flow in each direction. And I would say the same thing about Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, sometimes he might seem like he's a bridge out of the faith, but sometimes that might not be true either. And so I won't shove your example in her face, I guess. But yes, I think that Kierkegaard has helped more people than he's hurt. I know multiple people have been encouraged by Kierkegaard. I remember he talks about proofs for the resurrection or something like that. And I remember him being like, look, you're not going to find what you're looking for, basically, if you try and logic yourself into arguments for the resurrection. The arguments for the resurrection are in the way that you live your life as a Christian, and you'll see that the only thing that can motivate you to do those things is your belief in the resurrection. And that's the evidence of the resurrection that you really need, is the fruits that could only come about through faith in it, or something like that. That was a rough paraphrase. Right. I'm sure that if someone were to actually read the paragraph that I'm talking about, it would end up being very different. But this is the version of it that got stuck in my mind. And like that whole, I think that it helped me get out of my propositional head in a certain kind of way that I really needed. And that Kierkegaard, while he's very heady and very intellectual, he tries to draw people out of just the mere propositional part of Christianity and into something deeper and more existential, I guess, is really the only right word.
That's exactly how I saw it. And that's actually why I love Kierkegaard, because my dad is kind of the guy where he's not propositional at all, does not think about any of this stuff that we're talking about. He just walks the talk like all the time, every day, and I really admire him for that. He's a very righteous person in my eyes, and like he doesn't even. I just see him as like a unaware righteous person. I don't know if that's a good way to put it, but yeah, he's just always thinking about like when I was when I'd have these bouts of just being down, depressed as a teenager. Just be like, why are you depressed? You have food, you have a roof, you have a you just kind of like grill into me with the tough love a little bit. But Kierkegaard is like this guy who's very intelligent, very smart, and he's just telling you to like, hey, why are you thinking about all this stuff? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's important, but I mean, it's like you said, ultimately you're not going to logic your way into it. It's like more of a emphasis on the doing than the thinking. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's what really attracted me to Kierkegaard, was he kind of seemed to be both. He's like really smart, but he's using his smartness to kind of tell you that you're dumb for overthinking it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And then of course, when I look back in hindsight, it almost seems like a Jewish approach to things, where it's like, okay, it doesn't really matter where you're at as far as beliefs. Like even if you're struggling, it's like you still got to do the things, and like the mitzvahs and all that stuff. It's like that comes first, and then the understanding comes later. And I kind of see Kierkegaard doing that with Christianity.
Yeah, interesting. All right, so we've got Bart Ehrman, we've got Kierkegaard, we've got Jordan Peterson, and Bret Weinstein. Who else was important in your journey?
Well, I mean, I'd say Jacob was pretty important in my journey too.
And Jacob Faturechi, we'll put him up there in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah. That was more personal than, I guess, intellectual. He was just always there to answer questions that I had, and he, like, looking back, it was pretty clear he was trying to, like, go out of his way not to be like, yeah, Judaism's true, just join Judaism. Like, it was never like that. I just always would ask questions about, Christianity, to what he did know, and then Judaism, a little bit about Islam. And I remember when he first mentioned Noahides to me, I was like, oh, I don't know what those are, but it sounds kind of dumb.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't like the name. Kind of sound cheesy, but so yeah, I think that's more or less like the big thinkers, or the big speakers, I should say, that really influenced to where I am now. And the result of that was the reason why I was even at the crossroads, because I recognized the limits of reason, which I already knew, because that's kind of like part of the scientific enterprise, right? Like, they're not trying to grasp absolute truth, just trying to approach things with probabilities. But the second part was the necessity of faith. That was the part I didn't really grasp before. It didn't really hit me. So even as an atheist, there's still faith involved there. It may not be religious faith, but and then it kind of led down to this series of questions, like, okay, well, what is faith? Is all faith equal? Is it all the same? And I don't think so. I think some faith can just fly in the face of reason and logic and evidence, and then there's faith that doesn't. It's super rational in a sense.
Yeah. So what questions or what topics do you have for me that you want to talk about? What questions are at the top of your head?
Yeah, so I do have a few.
Sure.
The first one, I'm trying to remember the first one I sent you. It's along the lines of Bart Ehrman, but there's also James Tabor. I don't know if you know much about Paula Fredriksen.
I don't know Paula Fredriksen nearly as much. I recognize the name, and I know that she's connected to that, but I haven't interacted with her work very much.
So yeah, I guess the motivation for these questions is the video that I watched of yours.
With James Tabor.
Yeah, that one, but also just talking about what are the viable positions to take as a Christian, I guess. And when I started your 2-hour video on the development of a doctrine of early Christianity, right from the get-go, I was like, I'm not going to include the Jewish Christians. And I was like, oh, man, that's too bad. But hey, that's okay, because that's what I wanted to ask you about.
Sure, that's fine. And obviously, the purpose of that video was not aimed at someone who had the sort of questions you did. It was that video was more or less laser aimed at Protestant Trinitarians, trying to put them in an uncomfortable bind. And so anyway, that's, you can't address every question in every video, but
for sure.
Jewish Christians, I should say, in the biblical Unitarian community, there's a minority, but not a negligible minority, of people who are into some version of Hebrew roots, or some version of Torah keeping, or some version of Paul within Judaism. And you can imagine how such a crowd would be interested in Unitarianism as well, like vice versa. And sometimes I know people who found the sort of Jewish Christianity through Unitarianism, and some people who found the Unitarianism through Jewish Christianity. So this is sort of an active subject. Like my friend Brandon Duke has wrestled with this a lot. Brandon Duke also grew up in a group that was Sabbatarian and kept some version of Torah. But basically some idea that the law was still active and that the festival should still be celebrated in a Jewish way and stuff like that. And so he's probably my fellow biblical Unitarian who has wrestled with this question the most, and I've talked with him the most about this. And so, well, I guess, do you want to, could you maybe explain what you think the position of Paul within Judaism is, and what sort of that argument is?
Yeah, so my basic understanding of Paul within Judaism is that the religion of Jesus and his apostles or his disciples was different from the one that ended up coming out of Paul. But, and this is kind of where the camps kind of split, even within Judaism stuff. On the
Some
Paul
people are like
side,
Paul bad, right? Yeah.
Well,
Non-Pauline Christianity good, Paul bad. All bad things are Paul's fault. Yeah, that's a simplification, but it's not that much of a simplification sometimes. And then there's the people who are like, actually, even Paul is on the Jewish Christian side if you read him a certain way.
Yeah. So on the more Paul sympathetic side, and I didn't read everything that Paula Fredriksen has wrote, so I could be wrong, but I understand her position to be more of Paul not only was within Judaism for the Jews, but also like even when he was bringing his gospel to the Gentiles, it wasn't him saying like, "Oh yeah, Judaism is old and outdated, or it's no longer relevant." It was more like, "No, you guys don't have to keep the Ten Commandments like the Jews." Like, and he still considered himself a Jew, and so there's like that harmony of it's just him and his gospel for the Gentiles, without anything negative about Judaism. And then on the other side of things, like I think about James Tabor, I think if I remember correctly, he sees it as that may have been the case to begin with, but at some point he clearly departed from his Judaism.
Even Paul goes beyond that or something.
Yeah.
So maybe we have a early Paul who is still kind of Christianity within Judaism, but at some point he makes a personal break and goes his own way and leads what will eventually be billions of people after him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty much. So I kind of lean more on the Tabor side of things just because of the evidence he presents. I finished his audiobook, the Paul and Jesus, I think is what it was called. Really, really good book. I'm still processing the whole book, but it was amazing, especially the last few chapters.
Yeah, I was just making sure that is the book of James Tabor that I have and that I read and that I talked with him the most about. Yeah, so my thoughts on this are, I don't know, a little bit complex, but I guess a little bit simple. I think my simple answer is that I do not think Paul was very unique, and that I don't think Paul was as individually influential as that argument gives him credit for. And that I think that Paul was a major player, but I don't think he was a singularly influential player as that story often makes it out. And I think it's sometimes easy for us to overstate Paul's influence because of how much of the New Testament is written by him. And I think that basically because Paul was better at writing and having his writings get kept by posterity, that we perhaps get an overblown impression of how influential Paul was. And I don't mean that to criticize Paul. Like, I like Paul, but I think that part of this argument hinges on his sort of unique transformation of this religion in the creation of a new one, almost as a singular figure in this process of transformation. When I think that Paul was part of a group of people who were all sort of moving in the same direction. And was he important and influential? Yes, but was he that unique in his views? I think no. And was he even sort of the progenitor of a lot of these things? And I think the answer is no. So that's sort of my basic point, is that I think this gives too much credit to Paul, not because I don't like Paul or want to take something away from him, but I want to put him in his own context. Even Paul himself complains about his own lack of influence a lot of times, and seems to be battling with people who have a bigger reputation than his. But I think that a couple things. I think that another thing that my studies of early Christianity have helped me understand and realize is that really a lot of the unique Christian doctrines, and I can totally understand what I'm about to say leads itself to a skeptical interpretation. I think a lot of what's unique about Christianity is stuff that Jesus taught after his resurrection, in terms of both before his ascension and after his ascension. And that a lot of what is unique about Christianity and what took it away from Judaism are things that the apostles received as revelations from Jesus after his ascension into heaven. And so obviously a skeptical person could be like, well, those weren't real revelations from Jesus in heaven. I get that. But I think that having faith in Christianity is having faith in that a lot of these things were taught to the apostles only once they were ready, and that it was revelations from Jesus through the Holy Spirit after he was in heaven that really helped set the trajectory of Christianity. And like what I'm saying shouldn't be that controversial to any Christian who's ever read the book of Acts, because a lot of the biggest bombshells in the book of Acts are when Jesus gives a revelation to either, like most prominently, Peter, not Paul, when Peter gets his revelation of the sheep coming down and the animals on it, and the voice saying, you know, kill and eat. And Peter saying, no, far be it from me to eat anything unclean, Lord. And then that happens 3 times, right? And then he goes to is it Cornelius's house right after that? And then, of course, Paul's revelations, and Paul claims to seemingly have had multiple of these revelatory experiences where he's taken up into heaven. But it's not just Peter and Paul either. John also claims to, in the book of Revelation, and whether or not the author of Revelation is the same as the author of the Gospel of John, that is an important, relevant discussion. I'm a little bit agnostic on the question, but whoever wrote the book of Revelation claims to have been taken up into heaven and to have been taught some very important things regarding eschatology in the end times, and then to have written this to the churches. And those are just some of the things that we know about. I think that early Christianity was very charismatic in the sense that lots of people were having visions, and that it was sort of commonly expected that these things would be happening, and that they should be taken seriously, and that there was probably some, testing process. Like, you can certainly see the question of, how do you tell a true vision from a false vision? How do you tell a true prophet from a false prophet? That's a very important question in the New Testament writings. But I think that's evidence of what I'm talking about, is that these sorts of visionary experiences were very common, and that they were having to wrestle with what this meant, and that a lot of what is Christianity is the sort of coalescing and condensing of these various revelatory experiences into something like a coherent theological package. And that Paul was one of these people, but he was by no means the only one. I think that Peter, Paul, and John were all New Testament examples of this sort of caught up into heaven, having some very important experience that Jesus really wants you to communicate to the rest of the followers back still on earth. And I think that another part of this is that I think it's a little bit easier for a biblical Unitarian to understand why this is important. Like, if you think that Jesus is just God on earth walking around, then of course he would know all truth and know everything. And so the question would be, why wouldn't Jesus just explain everything the first time when he's on earth? But if you think that Jesus is a human who is in a constant state of learning himself, and that Jesus himself sort of gets a series of revelations, and that the biggest and best revelations are when he finally ascends into heaven. Like, if you read the book of Revelation, even in the first verse, it's basically like, I, John, was in the Spirit and got caught up, and Jesus gave me a revelation that God had given to him. And so Jesus sent an angel to me in the Holy Spirit so that I could then tell you what Jesus had himself learned from God. So why would Jesus need to learn something from God? What would Jesus be learning from God if he was God? It's easier for a biblical Unitarian to make sense of, well, actually, of course, when you go to heaven, you learn new things. And so I think that part of a really big piece of the puzzle of this relationship between Judaism and Christianity and Jewish Christianity is the question of how people were sorting out which of these revelations were authoritative and not. And that a lot of the distinctive Christian things that make it not Judaism or not Christianity within Judaism, like the law being superseded, Gentiles having this sort of equal spiritual place as Jews, and rules around circumcision and eating, and table fellowship between non-circumcised and circumcised people, and all of those sorts of things. I think a lot of those important questions were not answered or taught by Jesus explicitly prior to his death and resurrection. And that a lot of those things were things that the apostles came to learn and realize through revelatory experiences from Jesus after the fact, in, say, the first decade or two of the, say the 30s and 40s AD or something like that. And even then, revelation might not have been till like the 60s or 70s or even 80s AD. And so it's not like this all happened even super quickly. That I think that is sort of, I haven't answered every question yet, but I'm sort of laying the groundwork of what I think my answer is. And I think that this is something that Christians need to be honest about, that Christianity is the religion that Jesus taught his apostles from heaven in the early period, not just what Jesus said prior to his resurrection. And I can see, obviously, how that opens up a skeptical line of inquiry. I'm well aware.
I definitely agree. The Unitarian position is much more defensible here. To go back a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and assume that you think Tabor's position, or his that his approach to the scriptures are too strict. I'm guessing. I forgot.
Too skeptical, or what
yes,
do you mean by,
too skeptical.
Yes.
Yeah. I forgot exactly how he laid it out, but it was like 7 out of 11, or I forget what the number was, but like we can accept this is like pretty authentic, and then these ones not so much, and
Tabor's not unique in that. That's actually a relatively standard academic position, that there are the undisputed letters of Paul, there's the medium disputed letters of Paul, and then there's the most disputed letters of Paul. I generally think that there's just not enough evidence to say that any of them aren't Paul. I'm not convinced. I think that maybe there are some issues in the New Testament that I could be okay with. Like, why does so much of 2 Peter seem like it's an exact copy of some things that are in Jude? And like, I've read sometimes like, well, it could have been that someone ruffled their pages early on when they were making a copy of 2 Peter, and like a page of Jude was accidentally inserted into 2 Peter or something like that. I'm like, okay, actually, fine. Maybe I could be convinced of some of those things. And like, okay, maybe 2 Timothy does seem a little different, but I'm generally of the mind, like, I think it's harder to determine these questions of authorship than we sometimes make it out to be. And that I think that different people, like an individual person, can just sound different at different times in their life, especially since we also know that Paul sometimes had co-authors, like the 1 Corinthians, there's a named co-author. And so sometimes I think that when we look at what we call authentic Paul, it's Paul and some different co-authors. And so when Paul isn't writing with that co-author, he sounds different. And I do think that sometimes Paul would dictate his letters to a scribe or someone who's writing it down. And obviously that might go through some process of not sounding exactly the same way when it's a different scribe or something like that. And so I think all of those things are perfectly viable alternatives to splitting apart which of these epistles are authentic and not. So I tend to have a much higher view of almost all of the Pauline epistles basically being genuine. Although I do not think that Hebrews was written by Paul, but anyway,
that one for sure, though.
Yes, that one for sure. That one, even in English, you can tell that it's different. Even across translation, if you read them closely enough, you can be like, this is different. Whereas even when I'm reading 2 Timothy, I'm like, this seems like Paul. This seems like the other letters, if I'm being honest. Either that or it was an extremely accomplished forger. And it's then unclear. So who's this forger and what's his motivation? And how exactly did he pull this off, allegedly? I'm not saying that there aren't forgeries in early Christianity. Like, dealing with the church fathers, especially people like Ignatius or whatever, I do, it's not unreasonable. Early Christianity was full of people who were trying to make up letters and attribute them to people who had greater authority than themselves to win some theological battle in their day. That definitely happened. And so it's definitely a valid question to ask if that happened within the New Testament itself. But I tend to have a much higher view of these questions, even in my most skeptical moments, than someone like Tabor or Ehrman does.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's a question I want to ask, but it's going to tie to a later question.
Sure.
I'm not sure if I'm going to be clever enough to tie them together. But it has to deal with, you mentioned the skeptical, like the skeptical viewpoint of some of these claims. And I would say, how there's an argument against Protestants, something like, well, the church as an institution has been guided by the Holy Spirit, and to reject that has these implications, and so I feel like that same argument can almost be applied to them if you go back all the way to Judaism in a way. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but that's where I kind of get skeptical, because it's about what revelation is legitimate or not, and it's like I guess it's a question of where the authority derives from. And
yeah.
I think what I've found in my conversations with Christians, especially in real life, is it's just there's two different authorities, and I think that's okay. It's just I find it definitely helps when I'm trying to talk to, I guess, the people in real life about these types of stuff, because it can get kind of touchy at times.
It's touchy, and it's also a hard subject to talk about. I think that,
and I don't mean it to. I just want to say that it's like I'm really trying not to provoke, but
I don't feel provoked. I mean, this is a question that I wrestle and struggle a lot with. Also, is that I think, to me, it's inescapable that at the end of the day, that all authority claims will have some amount of just taken on faith at some level. That they basically ground out, so to speak, in some, assumption or axiomatic trust. And that it's, you can argue about, well, some forms of trust and authority make more sense than others. And some versions of explaining why you have this authority are self-contradictory or less plausible or something like that, or have various problems with it. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be some sort of grounding in, like, well, I just believe this and I can't give you any more reason why, other than that if I believe this, this is what follows from that, sort of thing. Like, I accept the chain of Roman bishops culminating in the current Pope Francis and the institution associated with him. And you could say, that makes sense for these sorts of reasons. But at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to just have it purely be logical. At some of the end of the day, it's like a trust thing. And it's like, an Eastern Orthodox person's like, well, why aren't the Catholics right? Well, at this council, they got excommunicated and didn't believe the right thing. Yes, the Catholics. Why are the Orthodox wrong? Well, at this council, they got excommunicated and didn't believe the right thing. It's like, okay, so how am I supposed to adjudicate which of you is right if you are both excommunicating each other and then having later councils where you criticize each other? It seems like you're just in mirror image opposition to each other, and I just kind of have to arbitrarily pick which of you I like best. And you could do the same. Okay, well, what about the Egyptian Orthodox? They didn't like the Council of Chalcedon. And so they're just like, well, there was a council that got things off track, and we have our own councils, and we have our own chain of bishops that go back to the Pope of Alexandria. It's like, Okay, so there are at least 5 or 6 competing groups that have the apostolic chain of bishopric authority going back to Huizar, whatever, that are in mutual contradictory, we don't agree with each otherness. And so it's like, I'm not saying that necessarily disproves that one of them couldn't be right, but it seems like from the outside, I have no way into deciding really which of those I think is right, unless I'm using some higher standard of authority other than the claim that those bishops have their own authority within them. Right? You understand what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
I would have to be appealing to something higher than
Like,
what
what's the
it seems.
criteria?
Yeah, what's the criteria? And then I'm appealing to a criteria that is in some sense sitting above the claim of authority of bishop mission, but their own claim of authority is at the level of bishop transmission.
Yeah.
And so how could I use something higher to judge something that is not? Then if there is a higher criteria by which I can tell which of these is correct, then that's actually where the authority lies and not in the bishop transmission. But then they're claiming that it lies in the bishop transmission. And so then and again, I'm not saying that they can't be right. It's just that I'm left. It's just I'm left in this impossible quandary of how do I pick which of you is right when there's seemingly, it would be self-contradictory to use some sort of criteria to pick amongst you. It would be more like I would need to be born into one of you and just like be shaped by the assumption that you guys are right and then keep doing the thing that you guys are right about. And I'm not saying that is necessarily self-contradictory or logically indefensible or something like that. It is logically defensible. It's just here I am on the outside and I don't know how to get onto the inside of that in a way that logically makes sense from where I am, unless I just have some sort of, axiomatic transformation that causes me to be transformed into one of these groups. And that happens to people. People just become Orthodox, or people get attracted to it for reasons that they can't explain, or people can become Catholic. And I'm not saying that like that can't happen, but it's a weird sort of thing to get transformed into the authority is basically bishop transmission or something like that. But then, okay, so then what exactly is the Protestant counterproposal? And it also will seem like I totally get, like, people in the comment section or on various internet forums all the time bring up the idea of, well, you trust in these, particular books of the New Testament. This was decided that these particular books were the authoritative one by some council. And so therefore, if you agree with that list of books, then you're giving credence to that council. And therefore, you should give credence to the creeds of that council. And therefore, the only way to logically, coherently believe in this list of books is to be part of the institution that came up with that list of books. And I totally get that argument. And believe it or not, I thought of that when I was a teenager, people out there on the internet. Like, it's like not like this just occurred to me suddenly, the other day. And I remember being really troubled by that particular question at certain ages in my life. But part of me is like, it's not that different to just axiomatically say that these are the right books and there aren't any others than to just axiomatically say it's this line of bishops and not any of the other ones. And that, okay, that brings up a weird sort of question of why. But that weird sort of question of why seems present no matter which direction you choose in this kind of mucky morass. And
so is it all just axioms, Sam?
And it's hard for me to get out of the answer that it is sort of seemingly just axioms somewhere.
The postmodernists win. No, I'm just kidding.
The postmodernists win. But except maybe in, like, you could do like an appeal to Paul Ann Leitner style metamodernism. It's like, yes, at some level you grounded me out into some axioms, but everyone will get grounded out into axioms at some point. You too, Mr. Deconstructor. And that
I don't like to admit it, but yeah.
But these are just the axioms I've inherited, and so I'm going with it, and this is what I've got, right? And I think that that's sort of kind of like the place that I'm at, that I just sort of accept the New Testament canon. And I think that I could say, I mean, I could make a couple statements that are defending this position. When I look at the early church fathers, when they're having arguments about the canon, which they do every once in a while, like even in early Christianity, the arguments about the canon were mostly, who are these Gnostic books and where are these coming from and why we shouldn't believe these Gnostic books. That like in the 2nd century, you don't really hear any disputes over what we would think of as the canon between Christians. You mostly just hear disputes of, these Gnostics wrote books and they aren't as good as our books. And the arguments that they give why is that they weren't written by an apostle or someone closely associated with an apostle, and that they're pretending to have a proximity to Jesus that they don't actually have. And so you have this kind of axiom of apostolic proximity that gives legitimacy to some books and not others. And like I said, in early Christianity, this was mostly just meant to disprove Gnostic gospels and Gnostic works as illegitimate. Although you also see arguments from the kind of proto-Orthodox Christians against the Jewish Christians, because they had a copy of the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew, although I think that means Aramaic. Although some people have convinced me enough, Sam, you keep you keep saying that when they say Hebrew in the 1st century that they mean Aramaic or something like that. What if they just meant Hebrew? They call it Hebrew. They had words for Aramaic and Syriac, but they say they use the word for Hebrew. Maybe they just meant Hebrew. And well, is Hebrew then a dialect of Aramaic? Anyway, whatever. Okay. So, but there clearly was some sort of gospel that groups like the Ebionites had that they claim was the original Gospel of Matthew that was written in Hebrew, not Greek, and that this is their one true gospel that they hold on to. And so then you get the proto-Orthodox trying to argue against this book, but they can't use the trick that they use against the Gnostics because they agree that Matthew would be a reliable source. And so they kind of mostly say that they either say that they modified it to include things that are not true, or that simply it's like, well, maybe that book is fine, but why don't they accept these other books as well? And so you kind of see both of those arguments when they're criticizing the Ebionite canon, which seemed to have been just one book, as best as I've seen. And then they have to defend Paul because they know the Ebionites do not like Paul. So I'm also admitting, this Paul was the problem all along narrative goes back a long ways. It's not like something that 20th century or 21st century scholars invented. This argument seemingly goes back to the 1st century itself. So I will admit that. But then part of me is like, all right, so that's the early period. And then the proto-Orthodox are mainly just saying those Gnostic books are not early enough or not by someone close enough to Jesus or an apostle to count. And the Ebionites, either their book is modified and that way it doesn't count, or it's fine, but it's insufficient because all these other books should count as well. And then only later do you really start to see arguments between proto-Orthodox Christians about which books are in the canon or not. And some of the books that were most argued about, we know that there were some Christians who didn't like the Gospel of John, who seem to have been otherwise Orthodox. They're sometimes called alogi, or the illogical Christians, because they don't like the logos in the Gospel of John. There were a lot of disputes over the book of Revelation. But this seems to have been, I think, mostly a 4th century argument, because a lot of Christianity prior to the 4th century had a premillennial eschatology and a view basically that the Antichrist was probably going to be a Roman emperor. And then Constantine comes to the throne, and that sort of throws a wrench in the narrative of the Antichrist being a Roman emperor. And I'm sure that there were some Christians at the time who were a little bit nervous about this Constantine figure. I bet the vast majority were thrilled, but I bet there were some who were like, can we really trust this empire business to be Christian for us? And then I think there was basically a battle between amillennial eschatology and premillennial eschatology. And Eusebius of Caesarea seems to have been the main leader of introducing amillennial eschatology. And I actually think he was hugely influential on the eschatology of the Catholic and Orthodox Church, even though Eusebius is technically a heretic because he was an Arian. But I think that his writings on eschatology were very influential in the theology that came after. And Eusebius really did not like the book of Revelation. And while he never comes straight outright and says that it shouldn't be included in the canon, every chance he gets when he's talking about the book of Revelation, he's always trying to undermine his credibility and authority. Because I think he knew that it was just too readily of ammunition for the premillennialists who he didn't like the eschatology of. And so there were a lot of disputes about Revelation, but obviously Revelation gets included. Although I've heard that Orthodox people will not cite the book of Revelation in their liturgy. And I've heard some people say that it's because like it's a mystery book, and so it's supposed to be even more mysterious than that. I honestly bet that's probably not the explanation. I bet the explanation is that there were too many people who worried that people would misunderstand it and come to premillennial eschatology conclusions and get too millenarian about it, and that they downgraded its exposure to the public accordingly. I suspect that's what happened. But anyway, and then there was other disputes, but in terms of the main dispute, and there was disputes about the book of Hebrews over mainly the question of was it written by Paul. So they're native Greek speakers. They could totally tell for the same reasons we can tell that this doesn't seem like the other works of Paul. So it's not like they couldn't notice that too. But then obviously all those things got included. So in some sense, I guess I'm aware that when I say this is what I think the canon is and not the other books, that in some sense I am accepting the conclusions of people who had conclusions on other subjects that I wouldn't agree with. But also, contrary to popular opinion, there was really no early church council that settled the books of the canon. It's not like at the Council of Nicaea or something like that, or any other council in the early period for that matter, they said about here's the list of books. It was honestly just kind of argued about a little bit, but just sort of like never really settled. But what's interesting is when you read the arguments about the canon in the early Christian period, they don't just appeal to their own authority as how to determine which books are in the canon or not. Because when Eusebius, being a bishop, is arguing with some other bishops about the book of Revelation or whatever, he can't just appeal to his own authority as a bishop because the people who disagree with him are also bishops. And so they're always using criteria for determining which books should be in the canon. And the criteria is simple enough. It's like, it needs to have been written by apostle or someone closely associated enough with the apostle to have their authority brush off on them or something like that. And that it needs to come from this apostolic period. And if it doesn't, then that's it. Then it's out. And so a Protestant can just be like, I like that criteria. And then that criteria is then the axiom. It needs to be written by apostle or someone close enough to have their authority in their writings. Like, for example, Mark is oftentimes thought to have been the traveling companion of Peter. And so he's basically just composing the gospel according to Peter. But Peter was maybe illiterate or not quite literate enough to write a full gospel. And so Mark has the authority of Peter when Mark's writing the gospel according to Mark or something like that. And so a Protestant can just be like, I like that criteria, and it seems like these books were decided by that criteria, so why do I need to agree to your bishop authority when the bishops themselves didn't even appeal to their own authority, instead appealed to a criteria? So I actually think that is a logically viable move that a Protestant could say. But I agree that this question, it's not simple, and
Yeah,
you're not
I mean
going to get
it's
some.
definitely it's not like a gotcha from well, you
Yeah,
accept their canon, so why? Yeah, no, that's a pretty good answer.
yeah.
I hear you.
Basically, my answer is you're going to ground out in axioms somewhere in this process. And that's always uncomfortable when we have to defend our axioms, because the only way we could defend axioms is appealing to higher axioms. And at some point, there just aren't higher axioms. And like one could even ask the question, okay, I don't like that criteria if it needs to be written by apostle. I wish that the only canon I'll accept is something written by Jesus. It's like, oh, well, sorry, Jesus didn't write anything down as best we can, so you could pick a different criteria. Or I accept people who are writing into the 2nd century. It's like, well, then you're going to get the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas and a couple other things, all of which were disputed. And some people like Origen thought that the Shepherd of Hermas should be in the canon. And in fact, the earliest complete copy of the New Testament that we have, which was in the monastery in Sinai, which is, when you read the New Testament now, you're reading like 95% of what you read is from basically the copy of the New Testament, the oldest one that they found in the St. Catherine's Monastery near Mount Sinai in Egypt. But also, you'll notice if you read that copy of the New Testament, it has a couple books in it that we don't have. And so even then, there are problems and there are questions. And I think that specifically the Codex Sinaiticus included Shepherd of Hermas and Epistle of Barnabas, both of which I think are kind of sketchy personally. But then I have to come up with some reason. Well, so why not the Shepherd of Hermas? I don't know. It's from the 2nd century, not the 1st century, and it's like too far removed. It doesn't have apostolic authority on it. And the Epistle of Barnabas, I don't think it was written by Barnabas. And Barnabas even then is like downstream from Paul. And so it's too far gone. But then I'm appealing to my axiom. But yeah, I don't know. It's a complicated question, but I don't think anyone has as clean and neat of an answer on it as they tend to think that they do. Is sort of my answer.
Yeah. Well, for me personally, since I kind of did come outside into the inside, I didn't really have any predisposition to Judaism or Christianity. I mean, so what ended up deciding the turn from the crossroads was the Hasidic Jewish perspective for me, because it wasn't, believe it or not, the biggest obstacle to me wasn't choosing a religion.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually still grappling with the idea that there's an Aaronic and agentic God, like at the same time, because as an atheist, I didn't see any evidence for an agentic God, and I was like, how do I swallow that? Like that was a bigger problem for me than just, is Christianity true? Is Judaism true? And it wasn't until I was already, I guess, in dialogue with Judaism by the time I was looking into Christianity and thinking about these questions. But at some point, I would say the radical monotheism of Hasidic Judaism is what really kind of just at some point turned me. And it wasn't like a moment, right? Like I know a lot of people where there's a decisive moment where they just became a believer. And for me, it wasn't like that. It was just kind of happened over time at a non-specific point. And then I realized, I was like, oh, or I noticed that I was thinking more about God, talking about God as if he was in my world. And I don't know, it's just at some point, the Hasidic perspective kind of like took over my world.
Mm-hmm.
And then
How would you describe that? What is that Hasidic perspective on monotheism that you found appealing?
yeah, so there's this concept, and I'm still like I don't know Hebrew that well, so I'm probably gonna butcher some of it. But there's a concept known as Hester Panim, and it has to deal with the hiddenness of God. And the idea is something like this, where we can't see God, not because God's not there, but because he's hiding in a sense, and that kind of has like some profound implications on its own. But the idea is that the more that you immerse yourself in Torah, and I'm not just talking about study, but also living it, embodying it, you can peel back some of the layers of the veil and basically bring in more godliness into the world. And this is kind of connected with another concept I like. I'm not sure how much you know about Amalek in Judaism, but it's kind of like the inverse, where it's Amalek kind of embodies irrational doubt and cynicism and whatnot. And but anyway, it was just this idea that everything's interconnected, the spiritual and the physical. There's no separation between the two. The physical corresponds to the spiritual, and you can never not have them disconnect or connected. So I don't, like I said, it wasn't like this eureka epiphany that I had. It was just, oh wow. Like God is wherever that I allow him into my world, basically. And there was no, and I'm not trying to bash Christianity, but there was no like Satan as adversary to God, even Jesus as intermediary. Those things for me kind of take away from that kind of that perspective. It's like all God, basically. It's all God. God is one, and like for all the good and all the bad, all the evil, all the lovely and beautiful, it's all God, so to speak. And I would say I even talked with one of my friends he's known me for a long time, since we were kids, and he's been very amused at my own journey through all of this. And I told him that in a very real sense, just understanding the definition of God kind of changed my mind. Because, you know, the new atheists kind of reduce God to like a guy, an old man in the skies or in the clouds, right? Just like keeping track of everything. And it's like, no, that's not who or what God is. And in a very literal sense, we can't even fully comprehend God. Like, it's just not possible. Like, nothing can contain him in ideas. It's just whatever he's revealed to us through revelation. So I don't know if that sufficiently answers your question, but
how does that sort of answer the agentic versus Irenic aspects of God for you?
Oh, so I wouldn't say it directly answers that, but it somehow made a bridge, I guess you could say. Because once I saw that, I don't know, I just started praying. I remember I asked you for advice, like when I was still at the crossroads, like man, I feel awkward praying. Like, how do you pray? Like I don't like feeling not authentic about it, but I understand that, you know, I haven't lived this lifestyle for most of my life anyway. But yeah, it's kind of a difficult thing to talk about, but I don't know. I just like I just kind of know. For me, like I know God is there. I've talked to God, I pray to God, and I don't know how much else better to say it. It's a more mystical view, I think. But it definitely has transformed my whole life in a very I can't even really oversell it, in a sense. Like I found my woman who I married. We have a child together now. Got a house together. I go to synagogue, not as often as I'd like because of my schedule, but then
what's going to synagogue like for you? How do they treat you? How do they deal with you?
So most of them don't know what a Noahide is, but the rabbi knew. I kind of arranged a meeting with him before I started attending. I guess I'm a lucky Noahide, because I guess not all synagogues are like this, but I'm more than welcome there. I think I worry more than the rabbi worries about me, because I'm like, oh, I don't want to like do things that I'm not supposed to do, you know, because I'm not like Jewish. I'm like a Gentile within Judaism. But it's all mostly a learning experience for me, and I think that's primarily how he sees it, the rabbi. So it's like very patient, and you know, he wants me to come, basically. But I don't know. I worry about all the little details because I want to do it right.
Right. So, what do you think that looks like kind of intergenerationally for your family? And now that you have a kid, kids have a weird way of
Oh man, that's such a
focusing
good
these
question.
questions. Kids focus these questions in a way that, I don't know, being a bachelor doesn't.
Yeah, it's funny because in the months leading up to right before he was born, I think it was just one night I just thought about everything about his future. It's like, man, what's it gonna look like raising Noahide children, um, and then just explaining like what I believe and what we believe, and I mean, I guess the positive side of things, I am looking forward to the questions because I'm mostly here because of all the questions that I asked. So it's not like unfamiliar territory. But yeah, these were all questions that I asked the rabbi as well. But
Because
I'd say
you don't do circumcision, right?
no.
Or at least not in the
Well,
Jewish
no,
way. I
yeah,
mean, obviously, most American male boys are circumcised, but not in. Yeah,
not
you
in
know
that
what I mean.
sense.
Yeah. Interesting, huh?
Yeah, so I don't know where I read this or how accurate it is, but it didn't really surprise me. But it was something like, oh yeah, if you're a Noahide and you have a kid, they're likely just to convert to Judaism. So I guess I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. But I guess that's not really a problem for me either, because it's really up to him what he wants to do. As far as what the Noahide life entails for me and my family, a lot of it has to deal with what is religiosity, and sometimes I have a hard time. I'm not sure if this will be hard to understand. I don't think you'll have difficulty understanding this, but with a lot of Christians that I know, their idea of religiosity is something like, what do you call it? Asceticism, I think is what it is. And it's like, oh yeah, making these vows and not indulging in the pleasures of the flesh or something like that. Like that's their idea of being religious. You like have these strict lifestyle codes or whatnot, and within Judaism, it's just like, oh no, you're supposed to enjoy these gifts from God, but they have there's a proper way to do it, and like get married and have children. And then there's just a lot of Hasidic philosophy too. Like a lot of the resources that I've tapped into were from Chabad.org. It's like a very, very useful website. I've spent probably more hours than I should have on that website.
So, what are your thoughts on Jesus at the moment?
I don't. I've heard a lot of crazy stuff about like the like there are some when I've been digging around into the early Christianity stuff. I've heard things like he was what was it, like a Roman agent or something. I don't really think that. The one that kind of blew my mind that I didn't think about was, oh, Jesus was actually just a very messianic Jew, like Jewish rabbi, and basically,
Shocking. Yeah.
yeah. Well, okay, so to add a little more context, it's kind of like in Judaism, there's this idea where the Messiah will show up, when all the boxes are ticked off, basically. And the way I see it, it's like the more observant and I guess Jews and I guess people around the world are to the Torah, it will kind of like expedite that process. And so our actions kind of like facilitate the world to come.
Sort of a post-millennialism, right? Some Christians have that idea sometimes too, right? Like if we get like really good at following Jesus, then that'll help facilitate his second coming. Some strains of Christianity have that idea. Like the Puritans thought that.
But yeah, that's kind of how I understand it with Judaism. And
whereas Christianity was sort of like the opposite. Like things were so bad that like the Jews were doing such a bad job they couldn't even recognize their own Messiah, and that paradoxically and ironically helped Jesus be the Messiah that he was supposed to be. Right? It's sort of an inversion of that idea.
Yeah, and yeah, so that's what I mean by shocking is it's like, oh, what if Jesus was this guy, this Jew, who just really wanted to hype everybody up in a way, And then everyone's like, yeah, the end's coming. It's going to be here. And like, I'm going to be the Messiah. And then everyone's like, oh, yeah. And then that kind of creates this self-fulfilling prophecy and actually facilitates the world to come because everybody kind of hops on board. And I never really looked at Jesus that way. I didn't really consider that theory. And I thought it was interesting. I don't know how much I buy it, but that's yeah. So I guess I would say what I think about Jesus. I don't think he's God. I don't think he's the Messiah. I don't really have too many other opinions outside of that, except, you know, he was definitely integral to Christianity, obviously. But yeah, I guess going back to the axioms conversation, for me, oh yeah, I guess the reason why I brought all this up, it wasn't just the Hasidic perspective, because I also was like, well, is Judaism sound? Because I didn't know. Like, I wanted to look into Judaism too. So I compared Judaism with Christianity, and also just looked at Judaism on its own merits. And it's like, okay, Judaism seems pretty defensible. Like, you can doubt it. Like, you don't have to believe it's true, and that's a defensible position too, I suppose. But if you think Judaism is true, or at least that the claims, you know, of the Torah are true, when you place them next to each other, for me, it seems kind of obvious that Christianity isn't true just because of the Sinai event for a couple of reasons. It's like, one, we talk about revelation, right, which is more authentic and genuine. And you can have, you know, you can be skeptical about this to different levels, but it was a mass revelation about the history of a national people, basically. It wasn't just like one person or a few people, right? Like, that's kind of the, I guess, the Huizar argument, they call it, where it's like, unlike any other religion in the world, Judaism, you know, it's predicated on the revelation of entire nation, basically. And of course, you can poke holes through it. But I think the gist is that it's hard to fool a nation about its own history. And I think that's a little bit more robust than just one or a few individuals. And then the second thing is about just what was revealed at Sinai. It's like, you shall not add or take away from what I've commanded. And it's hard not to look at Christianity and see that they've added to it, like the Eucharist and baptism, and even just as Jesus being an intermediary. And I'm not saying that there is no concept of intermediary in Judaism, but it's definitely different. Like, I don't think it had anything to deal with atonement or yeah.
Well, in some ways, the priests were intermediaries for the people in terms of atonement, right? The priests would have to go through an extra level of purification process to be able to enter in the Holy Holies, or even not just on that day, but to do even other parts of the year ceremonies. They would have to go through extra levels of purification that the regular people did not. And therefore, they're in some sense acting as an intermediary to God on behalf of these other people who are not at the same level of atonement and purification as the people. So there is, you know, that I would say is intermediaryism, and is in some sense, yeah. So I keep thinking of 2 Corinthians 3 in this conversation. So actually, before I get to 2 Corinthians 3, I'll talk. So my dad recently did a trip to Saudi Arabia. And he was with this tour group that was being led by a guy named Joel Richardson, who he's not the only person who thinks this, but who thinks that the real Mount Sinai is in northwest Saudi Arabia and not the mountain that Christians normally typically attribute it to in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. And so my dad was on this tour, and there's a whole bunch of very interesting things at this site. There are 12 pillars, or the base of 12 pillars, sort of like you hear. There's a rock that seems split in a very dramatic way that sort of seems like it might be the rock where Moses caused water to come out. And there are a whole bunch of other things that just kind of, like, just archaeologically and looking at this place, seem to fit better than the mountain in the Sinai Peninsula. And Mount Sinai is often described as being in Midian, which if you looked at maps of where Midian is supposed to be, it's northwest Saudi Arabia and Jordan, not the Sinai Peninsula of what we currently think. But anyway, whether or not this mountain is the right mountain, I'm not. That's not why I'm bringing it up. Why I'm bringing it up is like I've been talking with my dad recently about, and my dad's been like, Mount Sinai, that was like the main event. That was like the biggest revelation of God that's ever happened. Saying similar things to what you just said. It was in front of a crowd. There was thunder and fire and earthquakes and a cloud and yada, 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 yada. A whole bunch of things that were self-evidently visible to many, many people. And I've heard Jacob talk about various sort of, interpretive traditions in Judaism that talk like about, God's voice was so powerful that it killed everybody who heard it. And then they were resurrected on the next syllable, and then killed again, and then resurrected. And I'm not trying to mock that idea, but basically what my point is that Judaism puts a lot of theological oomph on Mount Sinai. That's why I was bringing that up. And my dad was like talking about, man, there's a lot of theological oomph on Mount Sinai. I'm like, well, you got to be a little bit careful, Dad. If you say that it's the most important revelation of God, then you're going to undermine the revelation that was through Jesus.
Yeah.
Right. And so I grew up, and my church background has a lot of dispensationalism in it. Like the group that I grew up in was like very super dispensationalist, and has sort of mellowed out on that over time. Dispensationalism is sort of falling out of favor at the moment in multiple places. But dispensationalism almost is in a weird way kind of close to Noahidism, in that it often would view Christianity as some sort of rescue mission for the Gentiles that wasn't quite as central or important as Judaism was. And that it was sort of like this, outgrowth or extension of God's work through Judaism. But it was not in any way superseding Judaism for the Jews. And that's not exactly the same thing as Noahidism, but it's in a similar direction, I guess. I'll say, to keep Judaism the center and Christianity the fringe, is in some ways sort of a logical conclusion from a dispensationalist framework. And that I sort of grew up in that kind of way. And of course, those are the sort of Christians who often really value the state of Israel right now for geopolitical and eschatological reasons mixed together. And obviously that's a whole topic in and of itself. And the Jews, of course, have weird mixed feelings about this sort of strange affection and geopolitical influence on the Republican Party that this dispensationalist eschatology has. But although, like I said, it's actually dispensationalism is falling out of favor in a lot of different circles. It's falling out of favor in my own circle, but I see that in other places as well. But so that makes me think of 2 Corinthians 3. And I think that you were talking about the hiddenness of God. The New Testament talks about the hiddenness of God a lot. And like the Gospel of John, no one has ever seen God. No one can see God. It's actually repeated throughout the New Testament many, many times, God's inherent invisibility and inaccessibleness to us. And you were talking about reading scripture as sort of this unveiling process of getting closer to God. And Origen talks that way a lot. I'll say, like, my conceptions of God in many ways have stayed the same, and that I still feel like I have some continuity of faith with myself as like a kid and a teenager, but more of like I would say a deepening and an enriching. And enriching isn't a word, but whatever, you know what I mean. When you were talking about this idea that God is in some sense hidden, but we get sort of like glimpses of him coming through scripture and living our life accordingly that connect us with him. It's not like the fullness of God yet, but it's some sort of, how would you put it? I don't know, sprinkling or something like that
Yeah, even glimpses sounds too much, honestly,
Yeah,
because you can't really glimpse God.
but it's in intimations of God or something like that, that aren't quite the full thing, but are still leading you in the right direction, and that are this sort of faith-inspiring experience. All right, so this is one of my things where I think that you cannot put Paul within Judaism, because I think 2 Corinthians 3 blows apart the Paul within Judaism paradigm. And 2 Corinthians is one of the epistles that no one disagrees about in terms of it being authentic. Even the most skeptical scholars think 2 Corinthians was written by Paul. So like, such is the confidence that we have through Christ towards God. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything is coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And there's this theme throughout Paul, right? That the law is good, but it's sort of bad in the way that it leads to death. Not that there was something faulty about the law, really. It was more there was something faulty in us. That the faultiness in us has the effect that when the law gets exposed to us, it kills us, not that it gives us life. And I know that there's a stronger antinomian view in Paul, obviously, than there would be in Hasidic Judaism. But it's not an antinomianism in the sense that the law was bad or that it was given by a bad God or something like that. It's almost in some sense that it was too holy for us, and that it wasn't able to, in and of itself, deliver what we needed. And that it's really the Holy Spirit that does that. But anyway, that's not like the main point I'm bringing this up. Now, if the ministry of death, carved in letters on stone, came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of its glory, right? So there's this idea, right? There's this glory, the Shekinah glory, that's coming with the Sinai experience, that even the Israelites couldn't look at Moses' face, but which was being brought to an end. Will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, and the ministry of righteousness must far exceed it in glory. Indeed, in this case, what was once had glory has now come to have no glory at all because of the glory that surpasses it. But if what was being brought to an end came with glory, how much more so is what will permanent have glory? And let's see here, skipping a little bit. Not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end, but their minds were hardened. For this day, when they read the old covenant, the same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Yet to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. And then skipping ahead, and we all with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. So I think for Paul and for other Christians, and you see this in the Gospels and especially the Gospel of John, there was this idea that the Old Testament had this layer of Christological revelation or something like that, where you could see Jesus foreshadowed, foretyped, and forexplained in the Old Testament, but it was like not understood or not taught or seen. And that Jesus then like kind of rips open this veil of this deeper meaning of the Old Testament that had been latent there the whole time, but had been unknown. And that like it's not just like prophecies like, I don't know, Isaiah 53 or something like that. But like all these things, like just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Like none of the Israelites before Jesus were reading the story about Moses lifting up the bronze serpent being like, oh, that's a foreshadow that the Messiah must be killed on a cross, right? Like no one had that interpretation prior, at least that I'm aware of. But like now you can see it. Like there's this like greater burst of glory that comes out of the Old Testament now that you can read it in the light of Christ. And that this Old Testament Shekinah glory that Moses had on his face is overshadowed by the glory that Jesus has in his face. Like we see the glory of God in the face of Jesus. And I think that is really Paul's Christology in a nutshell, is that Jesus isn't God himself, but looking at Jesus is like looking at God, because God comes to be seen through Jesus. And
so it is Paul's fault. No, I'm just kidding.
So it is Paul's fault, right? I mean, it's not Paul's fault. I'll say that. Paul is on the side of the people whose fault it is. But this idea that the old thing passes away, and he talks about the old covenant here coming to an end because it's not the permanent thing, right? The new covenant is permanent. The old covenant was temporally confined. And so and this is what I was talking to my dad about. Like, if you say that the Old Testament, if you say that the Mount Sinai event was the greatest revelation of God, then you're undercutting Paul's logic here. Because Paul specifically mentions the glory that Moses had on his face coming down from Mount Sinai as being glorious and wonderful. He's not undermining it or saying that it wasn't glorious, but he's saying that the glory that you have on the face of Jesus overshadows and surpasses that glory, such that we now have a new, more permanent, eternally glorious access to God than was previously available. But if you fail to see the glory of Jesus in the Old Testament, then you're in some sense still reading the Old Testament with a veiled face or something like that. And I think that Paul has a more similar view of God to the one that you were talking about this sort of God being essentially veiled and hard to get at, being essentially invisible. But you see these glory premonitions coming through, and that for him, Jesus is like the ultimate glory exposure to God that we have. I don't know.
Yeah, forget about the traditional atonement stuff. Just here's Jesus.
Well, not forget about it. I would say it's more like we can only understand the true significance of Jesus by understanding the significance of the Old Testament. But they did point to him. And so we wouldn't even know what atonement is or why atonement's necessary without the law. And that all of those things that help us understand the concept and practice of atonement, we can now understand them in their greater fullness through Jesus or something like that. And so it's not like the Old Testament is irrelevant, because it would be like saying algebra is irrelevant once you learn calculus, because you can't learn calculus without having first learned algebra. Well, no, you still need to know algebra to be able to do calculus. But once you can do calculus, you can do things that algebra itself wouldn't allow you to do, or so, that's just a metaphor or something like that. But it's not I don't think he's saying it makes it irrelevant. I don't think that that's Paul's take on the law or the Old Testament, but that it is in some sense, but it is superseded. I mean, I think he quite literally
that
superseded.
I don't think you can get away from that part.
Yes,
and as far as the Paul within Judaism stuff, as interesting as it is, I don't think Paul was within Judaism all the way. There's definitely, like I said,
that passage is impossible. I think that passage is impossible to make sense of with the Paul within Judaism.
Yeah. And then the question becomes, by what criteria do we judge which revelation was bigger? And then, well, I mean, I guess this is the third reason, right, that I kind of fell for Judaism. I don't think God gave the Torah to the Jews so they could fail and be replaced, basically, or effectively be replaced. And I think, from what I understand, is that God handed them the responsibility to determine what is legitimate prophecy or not, right? And so the logic that I kind of have, and I understand there's a counter argument to this, I just don't think it's too convincing. But if you trust and believe in God, and this is going to sound like the church argument almost, but you should trust and believe in the testimony of the people he chose to keep his Torah, at least over all others. And I guess another way you could put it is, I don't think anyone has any more authority on the book of the people than the people of the book. And if you think otherwise, I think it's hard for me not to see it as self-defeating as a Christian, because if you think the Jews can't be trusted to identify their God or faithfully transmit his Torah, then it kind of calls into question everything else that you do accept about, accepting the scriptural canon.
Do you think, say, I don't feel like I'm calling into question the ability of the Jews to transmit their Torah. In fact, I feel like I depend on their ability to do that correctly. Although I am saying that there is a fundamental interpretive disagreement.
Yes.
And like I'm saying, I of course still think it's perfectly valuable and valid to read the Old Testament. If anything, I think what Paul's saying gives the Old Testament more worth. I think what he's saying is that there was more there and more value in there than was even immediately obvious. And not like, okay, Jesus is here, just read my letters, don't ever read the Old Testament again. I don't think that's what he's saying. I think he's saying that there's even more glory in it than we originally were aware of, and that it gives it an extra value in a certain way. Although I'm not saying that. I see some of your point. I mean, I think Paul says you don't really need to follow the law in the same way anymore. You don't celebrate the festivals in the same way. And Paul, I do think baptism in some sense replaces circumcision as sort of the initiation ritual. The Eucharist replaces the other feasts and sacrifices as the sort of worship, sacrificial, communal eating thingy. And that the church then is, I think replace isn't quite the right word. I think supersedes is a better word than replace, because obviously all Jews had the invitation now to be part of God in a newer and better sense. And that there's this spiritual family of God that is in some sense better and higher, that all are invited into, than being, and this is where, again, I think that the Gospel of John and Paul are in such lockstep with each other, in such perfect agreement, that I don't think it's fair to just put this all on Paul. I think if you want to blame people for getting off track, you need to include more people than just Paul, is sort of part of my point. But the Gospel of John, like in the prologue, right? I gave a big presentation on the prologue recently. And so it says, let's see here. He came to his own people did not receive him. And again, I think this is talking about how both in the Old Testament, God's word was often not received by the people. They often rejected it, like golden calf incident, the whole exile thing, etc. There were numerous instances, and that's not some point that the Jews wouldn't be aware of, right? The Jews were self-aware of their own ability to not always follow the law and receive God's word. In the same sort of way, that's like that's a typological foreshadow of how Jesus comes to his own people. He's speaking the words of God, he's embodying the words of God, and he doesn't get received. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were not born of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And I think that this is this idea that Christianity has, that there's this new sense of what it means to be the people of God, that is non-biological in a certain sense. Not that Judaism is like purely biological, or else your son could never have any hope of converting to Judaism. So I get that it's like not just strictly biological, but that there's this new spiritual sense of being a child of God that the fleshly thing was a foreshadow of. And so it's not like the fleshly thing was bad or wrong. It was like sort of the algebra before the calculus. But the calculus now tells us that there's the real thing is to be a child of God through the birth of the Holy Spirit, or rebirth within you of the Holy Spirit within you, I guess. And so I can see why this is interpreted condescendingly by Jews, but I really don't think that that's quite right, because in some sense it is saying that there's something higher and better, which is condescending. But in another sense, it's saying that you guys were the only people who had the right thing that was pointing to this, that this is hooking up. It's not like Christianity is superseding paganism or something like that. It's not like it's superseding Norse paganism or superseding Aboriginal animism or something like that. The thing that it's superseding and the thing that it connects to and only makes sense within is Judaism, and Judaism alone. And so it is acknowledging the one trueness, the single truthness of Judaism. And without that, Christianity would undermine itself. But I don't think it's undermining itself, because I do think it's saying that the real full meaning of the Jewish religion was in some sense misunderstood, but it is as the precursor and the sort of the thing in stone before the thing in spirit, or the blueprint to the house, or the prerequisite course to the final course, the appetizer to the full meal. But it's not like anything else gets to play that part. And it's sort of like this was actually even more important than you guys realized, or something like that. I don't know. What do you think?
I guess to follow the analogy, I guess if it weren't for Sinai kind of being that event where it's like, okay, this is algebra, anything else is going to be, algebra plus. If it's not algebra plus, if it's something entirely different, then no.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what happened. Is it's like it's a foreshadowing, right? And then if it's a foreshadowing, it's something new, and that's kind of at odds. I don't see how you can really get around. I mean, at least I can't really see how you get around that part with Sinai, because it's like the explanation makes sense to me from the Christian perspective. It's like, yeah, it led up to this thing. It's just within the Jewish perspective, it's like, no, this was it basically, and this was the standard. And there's something else I was gonna say, but I forgot. Yeah.
But I think that really is the disagreement. I think.
Sorry, I remembered what I was gonna say.
Go ahead.
And the other thing too is it's kind of odd for me too, because in Judaism you can choose to convert. It's not like you're cut off. And there's also the the contentious subject of Noahides. Like, how biblical is that? And I know there's a skeptic view from the Christian side of that, but I mean, there's, from my understanding of the Torah, there's a clear place for Gentiles already. It's not it's definitely not like Christianity,
but it is a little bit of a step down the hierarchy in a certain sense, with Jews being.
You can say that.
Yeah, and I'm not saying hierarchies are necessarily bad.
It just depends what you take from that hierarchy. If it's worse or better, or I would say it's different. That's what I would say.
Right. And I think this discussion that you and I are having now is really the discussion that was happening in the first century. This really is the parting of the ways, was on this particular view of how Christianity related to Judaism, this sort of superseding in glory view that Paul had, although I really do not think Paul was unique in that. I think you see that in John and other places. So
I don't think Paul was that unique either.
No.
And he's kind of like the poster boy.
He's the poster boy. He was perhaps the best articulator whose writings we still have. I think that's really, he looks important because he was such a good writer. But at the time, he was not actually the vanguard in the way that we sort of often back project because of the importance of his writings after the fact. But I mean, not all Christians went this way either. The Ebionites, I don't think, would have agreed with this sort of superseding glory view of relationship between Jesus's new covenant and the old covenant. I think that there were some Ebionites who did communion, though, but they seem to have, there's a description, I forget exactly where it was. I was reading about this just a couple days ago. Some Ebionites would go to synagogue on Saturday and then do communion on Sunday. And so maybe you can imagine their view of communion being slightly lower and different, or something, like it was like some sort of new festival, but in no way replacing or superseding the old ones. But I mean, I do think that not all the Jewish Christians went in the direction of Pauline-esque. I'll say Pauline-esque instead of Pauline Christianity. I think that is true, and I do think that the Ebionites and other Jewish Christians date back from the very earliest origins of Christianity. They weren't some heresy after the fact or something like that.
And I was going to say, my first taste of Pauline Judaism was with Paula Fredriksen. And when I first heard her take, I was like, oh, wow, maybe Paul was just the Jew that was like opposing the other Jews of the Jesus movement. It's like, oh, no, they don't need to convert. They can just be Gentiles. And then he was trying to, fulfill that side of prophecy of things about how all the nations will turn to the one God of Israel. And in that sense, I just saw Paul as the guy who's trying to get the first Noahides together. But then I read some more, and then I read Tabor, and I was like, oh no, he definitely departed from, because there were damn, I forgot the chapter, but he mentions how there were other Jewish leaders of that movement who were okay with Gentiles being Gentiles, but not necessarily in the same way that Paul was intending. And I think you mentioned that too at the beginning of your video, your 2-hour video. So I was curious what you knew about that.
Yeah, I do think that there were. I think that there were. I mean, in the first century, obviously in the Book of Acts, you get this word God-fearer that happens quite a bit, where there's seemingly Noahides even before Christianity comes on the scene. There seems to have been groups of Noahides at Jewish synagogues in the Greco-Roman world. At least that's why I interpret that to mean. I know there's a lot of different views on that, but the only way I can make sense of is something that looks a lot like you just 2,000 years ago. And that it's obviously easy to imagine how Christianity viewed those as very fertile ground for converts. And I think that there were some Jewish Christians who might have continued to view things that way. And that, of course, the Messiah, if you're believing that Jesus is the Messiah, then you're, of course, supposed to believe that this is somehow shaping the Gentile world too, and reorienting the Gentile world back to the one God and away from paganism. And you could read even Paul's speeches in Acts to the Athenians or something as being very sort of Noahide friendly. But I don't get the impression that those Jewish Christian groups had too many Noahides around them. When you hear about them, I think that kind of proto-Orthodox Christianity seems to have probably outcompeted them in terms of the attention for Gentiles. Obviously, getting to be a full member is perhaps a little bit more attractive than a second-class member. So I don't, but there were, but then there's the other flip side of the thing, where I think that there were some Jewish Christians in proto-Orthodox Christianity who still kept the law. Justin Martyr mentions that. When Justin Martyr is dialoguing with Trypho asks them if he knows of any Jewish Christians who still keep the law and if that would bother him. And Justin Martyr says, keeping the law is not necessary for salvation. Although if there are some Jewish Christians who, even after they become Christians, still want to keep the law, that's fine, and it's not going to hurt them. But what would be wrong, and what Justin would consider heretical, is if they started requiring other people to keep the law too. And that would sort of be a red line that Justin Martyr was uncomfortable with. But if they're Jewish Christians and they're in his church and they're still keeping the law to some degree or another, that doesn't bother him, and it almost even sort of makes sense for him. Although at some level he thinks it's unnecessary, which I think is which is, I think, identical to what Paul says. I think that's the best way to make sense of Paul, is okay, kind of you can, I guess. If that's and I think he almost views that as sort of baby steps in the right direction. It is I think probably the best way to make sense of Paul. But I think at the end of the day, Paul is actually, once you fully get this and once you fully realize it, you'll see that the light that you see in the old covenant will be overshadowed by the light that you see in Christ, and there won't be any motivation for you to keep doing that, I think, is really sort of his answer to that question. So I think you see both sides of the coin, where there are some Jewish Christians in proto-Orthodox Christianity keeping the law, and they're presumably, although we know so little about groups like the Ebionites that it's hard to know if this was true or not, that there would have been Gentile Christians kind of hovering around them. But I get the impression that the Ebionites were pretty small, and even by the time Eusebius is writing about them, he doesn't seem to have any firsthand knowledge of them. It's he knows that they're out there somewhere and he's reading about them. And so he's writing down what he's read about them, but he doesn't seem to have actually interacted with them. So they couldn't have been too numerous or prominent. And it's hard to know when they go extinct. I have some idea that I think that they exist in the eastern part of the empire, or even further east than the borders of the empire. And that I do wonder sometimes if Jewish Christianity had a big role in the founding of Islam. And Islam would certainly make sense as some sort of weird prophetic movement that scrambled together some ingredients of Judaism, Christianity, and Jewish Christianity, plus some new things, and came up with Islam. I almost don't know how to make sense of Islam other than the fact that it must have been drinking pretty heavily from some Jewish Christian influences. So I presume that they were still out there in Arabia at the time of Muhammad.
Just carrying the torch a little.
carrying the torch, and that's just a region of the world that we knew very little about at the time. And maybe if we had more information and more sources, we would be like, oh man, there were all these Jewish Christians, and it was actually way bigger than we thought. Because from the Greco-Roman sources, it seems like they fade away from any sort of public awareness by like the 3rd or 4th century. But if they influenced Muhammad as much as I think that they must have, then they couldn't have gone extinct in the 4th century. They would have had to have been around till the 6th century, and common enough for that whole whatever happened exactly at the founding of Islam to have happened.
Well, that's what I love about all this is I'm just it's so nice that God made it so there'd be so much room to think a lot of different things about what happened. Because even though to me, I think I'm really convinced Judaism is true. But I don't think it's so obviously true that anyone that looks at it is going to be, oh yeah, I agree 100%. It's like, no, I don't really believe that. And then I also want to say that doesn't mean I fall on the very extreme end of, it's all axioms, man. And like, who knows? But I just think it's great. And I think if it were any other way, there wouldn't really be as much of a choice as far as, what to do the right or to follow the right or not. And then there's also the whole fact that, I believe that every person that's born, no matter time and place, it's like they're put there for a reason and they have everything they need to carry out God's will. So,
yeah. Do you have any other questions or topics?
Yeah, I know I've hung you up for 2 hours, but I do really have 2 more questions I want to ask.
Go for it.
The next one is the monarchical trinity.
Yeah.
Is it a trinity or is it actually just Unitarian, Sam?
It's funny. You're probably well aware that Beau Branson and Dale Tuggy have sort of been spatting back and forth about what the definition of Unitarianism and Trinitarianism is. And there was also recently Beau Branson and Dale Tuggy just last week were together on a panel. There's a book that's coming out with William Lane Craig, Beau Branson, Dale Tuggy, and William Hasker. 4 views, 3 persons, 1 God, or something like that is the title of the book.
Whoa.
And so Beau Branson and Dale Tuggy have had even more reason to interact recently. The monarchical trinity, I think it's by far the best form of Trinitarianism. So I mean that as a compliment, but I also mean that as an insult because I still think that it's probably a form of Trinitarianism. And I do think that I think it's interesting because Beau's basic point is if we're going to believe in the Trinity, we should believe in what the original formulators of the doctrine of the Trinity believed. And that's the Cappadocian Fathers and people around that time. And so what else could the doctrine of the Trinity mean if not that? And it's sort of like a weird form of restorationism. It's like he thinks that we need to go back in time to the original sources to clarify what this doctrine is, except he's not going back to the 1st century. He's going back to the late 4th century. And my whole question is like, well, why do that? And it gets back to that weird question of axioms. If you think that these church councils are of such special importance, I suppose that makes sense. But it's like, well, why would we be wanting to do our best to recapture the Christology and Trinitarian theology of the late 4th century? Why not capture the Christology of the 1st century? That seems to make more sense to me if we're going to base this whole thing on Jesus. But if we're basing this whole thing on bishops and councils and institutions, then I guess the 4th century makes sense. But my question is, why would we do that? And so I think that that's really the dispute. I mean, there is something kind of Unitarian about Beau Branson's monarchical Trinitarianism. It is. I've called it Unitarian Trinitarianism before, and I suppose Trinitarian Unitarianism would be modalism or something like that. But Unitarian Trinitarianism, and I still think that there are just some fundamentally weird things about monarchical Trinitarianism that are hard to make sense of, like, how can you be essentially fully divine and be uncaused? It seems like that eunomian question is still kind of at the heart of this whole discussion. And Beau Branson says it's not a problem, but yet I kind of think it's a problem. So I think at the end of the day, maybe monarchical Trinitarianism, part of the reason why it's hard to classify is because it doesn't totally, at the end of the day, make sense.
That's what really makes it a trinity right there, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
No.
Is that at the end of the day, it doesn't make sense. Yeah. All forms of Trinitarianism at the end of the day fundamentally don't make sense.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems like it gets really difficult when we're playing with the definitions of what's subordinate or not, right? Because almost like I'm definitely not, I don't mean this as an insult. I just think of this analogy of like two children saying like, oh, it's this, but it isn't. Trust me. And it's like, is it? And I don't know, that some of the lingo in that discussion definitely goes well beyond my head.
And I'll say, I think Beau Branson has been evolving in his views over the last couple of years. Like, I was first aware of his stuff maybe 5 years ago or something like that. And he does seem to have changed some of his language and ideas in response to pressure. And I've noticed that in Joshua Sijuwade as well. And I get the impression that there are a decent number of Trinitarians who find what they're saying uncomfortable. And that I think that over time, it seems like they're moving in a more Trinitarian direction and away from sort of a very strict monarchical view. Maybe that's unfair, but I get hints and flavors that they're feeling pressure to move towards more kind of standard, or I'll say familiar seeming Trinitarianism. And so it's curious if in the final analysis, really the vast majority of Orthodox Trinitarians will find them acceptable or not.
Yeah, that's the only reason why I was really curious about it, because I was, just thinking the implications if monarchical Trinitarianism became the norm, or
I would view it as an improvement. It's at least clear. I know what Beau Branson is saying when he's talking about the Trinity most of the time. Most of the time when I'm talking to other Trinitarians, it's just a gobbledygook word salad that seems to just like be equivocating on like 5 different words at once and shape shifting as soon as you poke at it. So I'll give it credit that it doesn't do that. And so I wouldn't view that as an improvement. And I do think that it makes sense of the New Testament way better than other views. But at the end of the day, maybe it's just, it doesn't quite really work either.
Yeah. So the last question I have is, so first, is it fair for me to say that at some point in early Christianity, before the Nicene Creed, there was a lot more room for healthy debate about the nature of, Christ and all that. Do you think there's any chance of like having a return to that in today's Christianity, where, because that's really the question, I guess.
Yeah, I hope so, but I do think it's also pretty clear that in addition to looking at the development of the Trinity over time, like in that video I made, you also see an escalation in how mean the different positions are to each other. I think that both of those two things happen at the same time, and basically at the same pace and for the same reasons. Like I said, Justin Martyr talks about biblical Unitarianisms, but he calls them members of his own race, and seems to, by implication in the context of what he's saying, views them as having been saved because they at least view that Jesus is the Messiah. And that's really the essential thing, is that Jesus is the Messiah. Whether or not Justin can prove that he was God before all ages, or really a God, is really the best way to make sense of Justin Martyr. Whether you can prove that Jesus was a God before all ages or not, that he hopes that he can, but even if he isn't able to prove that, the important thing is believing that Jesus is the Messiah. And so he does seem to have, he views it as a non-essential doctrine, I think, is really the only way to come away from that passage. And it's interesting, Irenaeus never lists biblical Unitarianism as a heresy in his book Against All Heresies. It's like, okay, so either he doesn't know about us, which doesn't really seem to make sense because Justin Martyr did, and Justin Martyr is before him, and Irenaeus loves Justin Martyr. So either he doesn't know about us, which seems pretty self-evidently not true, or he doesn't view it as in the list of all heresies. And I think that that's pretty clear. I think what happened is there was increasing intolerance for other views in basically all camps. And I think that was just sort of, I don't know, somewhat inevitable, although I kind of hope it wasn't inevitable. But I do think things got really supercharged once Christian theological debates got mixed up with battles for control of the state during the Constantinian period, because suddenly the stakes were super high. And I do think that something of Constantine's demand for unity within the church forced the issue in a way that was unhealthy, because really it was inevitable, I think, from Constantine's desire for a completely unified church, for there to need to be then a unified theology. And that forced these disagreements that could have been otherwise amicably held to then need to be settled through blood and battles and political infighting and all the rest. And I do think that that's part of what went wrong. I do hope for a time that Christology that the Overton window, I guess, more or less, on Christology opens up again. Because right now, especially within Protestantism, I get that Catholics and Orthodox at some level could never change their views on these things without breaking their tradition. And who knows, maybe Pope Francis is willing to break tradition, in which case then that could open up the Overton window on other subjects. But I really just don't think that'll happen. But I do think that it's about time for Protestantism to, okay, we have a range of acceptably discussable positions on eschatology or free will or the Eucharist or what have you. And why don't we have a range of theologically discussable opinions on Christology? There is still that Athanasian antibodies built into Protestantism that it doesn't know where they come from, but it comes from then. That I think that greater historical awareness will help. And I do hope that Christians get better at discussing these topics amicably, and not just like being nice to each other on the internet, but in terms of accepting each other as brothers and sisters in Christ and being in communion with each other through these arguments. My position on this has never changed, that I'm willing to have communion and view Trinitarians as fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, despite that invitation almost never getting reciprocated. And that I think that this needs to be settled like a family and not like enemies. And that I do hope that the Overton window will open. And I do think that the internet will, in some sense, make it impossible for that not to be the case. Because even if these churches or these seminaries or these theological conferences or whatever are trying to keep the Overton window closed and kick us out, people will still be listening to us on the internet. And at some level, the public dialogue has already shifted on that topic. And that I think it would just be healthier to acknowledge that that's happened. And even then, I should say, Dale Tuggy was still on that panel at the Evangelical Theological Society last week. So in some sense, that is what I'm talking about, even if it was funny during the Q&A, every single question, I think like 90% of the questions or more were, Dale Tuggy, how could you believe what you believe, biblical passage XYZ? And then Dale would be like, okay, well, here's my explanation for that. All right, any other questions for all of our panelists? Dale Tuggy, how can you believe that when biblical passage XYZ? It's like all the attention was on him. It was kind of funny. So I do think that is somewhat inevitable, and that is honestly one of the main goals of my channel, is to, in some sense, crowbar open the Overton window on this subject through winsome dialogue and treating other Christians better than they treat me.
Well, for what it's worth, I'm hoping for that too.
All right. Well, I think thanks for that. Any other questions?
No, I think those were the. Yeah, I mean, we already covered, the relationship between theology and historical evidence, I think, earlier. That's something I was wanting to ask, but I think we covered it. Because I think they both play a role. So.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing your story with me, Antonio, and thanks for asking me some hard questions and not letting me off too easy, I hope.
I mean, this is more of a learning experience for me than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
You're definitely one of my top favorite Christians, so to listen to. And
well, thanks.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, I can't think of a better place to end the interview.
All right. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Antonio.